All right, we're taking a look at the South and the slavery controversy, 1793 to 1860. Part 1 will look at the cotton economy, how the cotton gin expanded slavery and changed American history. Eli Whitney, of course, invented the cotton gin in 1793. He was a northerner from Yale. And mostly he just changed the idea of previous inventions and updated them. And largely this new idea, or updated idea, was largely successful. It reduced the labor for removing seeds and increased the labor needed to grow and pick cotton. Cotton became a profitable crop all of a sudden, while increasing the demand for slave labor. This gin, or engine, if turned with horses or by water, 2 persons will clean as much cotton in one day as 100 persons could clean at the same time, according to Eli Whitney, inventing the cotton gin. And so it very much speeds up the processing of cotton. Not the growing or anything like that. It's just taking the seeds out used to take a lot of time and labor. With this invention, that changes things. And so that cotton all of a sudden can make a lot of money. But that requires more workers to grow and pick the cotton. So slavery expands. So the slave population increased from 1810 to 1830. Now we weren't importing any more slaves. That stopped in 1807, at least legally. There was still some smuggling. But starting in 1807, the slave trade stops, and so mostly it's just through natural reproduction. And so from 1810, we had a population of 1.2 million slaves, moving up to 1830, population of 2 million. Early on, there were recent arrivals through the slave trade, working on small farms. However, by 1830, the majority of slaves were American-born, working on plantations or large farms. And you can see population density in certain areas where there were more slaves. You can see quite a lot in the Virginia area and kind of this belt that we'll talk about in a moment. And so cotton became king. Cotton became the big money maker. The South had strong ties to England because England needed the South. 75% of Britain's cotton came from the South. Despite Britain having an anti-slavery stance, they banned the slave trade, and they also banned slavery in all of their colonies. However, they were still making money off of slavery, so it was a little disingenuous of them. Cotton became the sole moneymaker in the South, and at least not the sole moneymaker, but at least the largest sole moneymaker. 3/5 of the entire American export market was cotton. All investments went into buying more slaves, more land. So this led to a massive expansion of slavery when it comes to buying more slaves, but also to purchasing and expanding land out into the territories, because cotton takes a lot out of the soil. And so once it's taken everything out of the soil, you need to move land, expand out, let that soil recover, and eat up some new soil, or plant something in its place to replace those nutrients. As the North decided to advance economically with the Industrial Revolution, with machines and factories, the South said, cotton is making us a ton of money, let's stick with that, instead of going into machines and factories. And we'll talk about the Northern ties in a moment as well. The North was definitely not innocent, in the same way that England was not innocent here. Those Northern ties I just mentioned, right? And that the North was guilty in its own way. Southern planters needed money to expand their businesses, to buy more land, to buy more slaves. And so they'd get loans from northern banks out of New York. So companies like J.P. Morgan Chase Bank today, or the Bank of America today. These are some of the banks that still survive that gave out loans to Southerners to expand slavery. And Southerners were okay with the Civil War, and because if there was a Civil War, that meant they wouldn't have to pay back those debts. And so some Northerners wanted to kind of keep the Union to make sure that they get that money back. And so Northern bankers were involved. All those factories up north making clothing. Where did they get their cotton? From the South. And so New England textile mills were fed with Southern cotton. If slavery ended, that means their supply of cotton ends, and we get massive unemployment in the North. And so the Northern factories are also relying on Southern slavery. And so the Northerners have their own guilt. The planter aristocracy. Hey, Colonel. And so the antebellum is just a word that means pre-Civil War. You'll see that every now and then. And the South is more of an oligarchy. And this means it's a government ran by a few people. In this case, it was mostly these rich planters and these rich planter families, the Jeffersons, the Washingtons, the Madisons, that would run the government and would have the most impact on southern state governments. And so these southern governments were heavily affected, more affected by the oligarchy, these rich planters, than they were the larger population of other citizens, of the poor and the majority population. So the rich were kind of running the show. And they'd even give themselves fancy titles like colonel. The colonel here is not an actual colonel, and anybody can become a colonel if you become famous enough in Kentucky. And so they're even giving themselves little royalty titles, even if they may not be so deserved. So I mentioned that majority, and smaller slave owners didn't own a majority of the slaves, but made up a majority of the masters. Wrap your head around that for a minute, and take a look at this chart showing slave ownership by Southern whites in 1860 on the dawn of the Civil War. The vast majority of whites did not own slaves. They were too poor to own slaves. Owning a slave is quite an expensive thing to start up. Just like owning a factory or a business, you would need some startup cash, and they'd usually get that from northern bankers. And so the majority of these slave-owning families would only have a few slaves, 1 to 9 for a small farm. However, the majority of slaves are on these red dots, these huge plantations where people are owning 10 plus slaves. And so the red dots are the big plantations where most slaves were. Yellow dots, there are more yellow dots, however, these are the small plantations. And so the majority of slaves would be concentrated in these red dots. However, most whites didn't own slaves, they were too poor. However, that didn't mean they didn't want to own slaves. Poor whites definitely did want to own slaves. 3/4 of the white population didn't own slaves, but they wanted to. The poor whites, they supported slavery. They were fine with it for a couple reasons. One, eventually, it's the American dream for them. They eventually wanted to own slaves, even though likely they're never going to be able to own slaves. And for them, that's the American dream, is having a big plantation and having these slaves working on the plantation. The idea of owning your own family business. In this case, the family business includes enslaving people. Plus, owning slaves, it's a status symbol. The more slaves you own, the more power you have locally. And even that translates into political power with the local oligarchy. It's also a social status thing in the social hierarchy. So not just social status and saying, I own this amount of people. It's also saying that I'm better than at least somebody. So as bad as my life is, as poor white hillbilly trash, at least I'm not a slave. And even they consider themselves above free blacks in this social hierarchy. So by supporting this oppressive system, they can say, okay, at least my life is not that bad. And that equality for them, they see this as a downgrade, and all of a sudden, yeah, my life is that bad. And so by maintaining slavery, at least they have some edge in this social hierarchy. So what about the free black population? In that in the South and in the North, some slight differences. In the South, free blacks were prohibited from having certain jobs, forbidden from testifying against whites in court, so their rights as citizens is definitely limited. Southern free blacks worked as day laborers, worked as artisans, they could be blacksmiths or have any other skilled trade, but really they come to be known as this third race, that they are not given the social status of even poor whites. Even if they have money, even if they're wealthy, they're still below. And so they're not truly free. They are not given equal status as citizens. Even if they have money, doesn't matter. There's a significant black population in New Orleans, and mostly along the border states like Maryland, like that. And what about in the North? Well, it's a tricky situation in the North, in that you're going to encounter racism in the North the same way that they're encountering racism in the South, but a slight different way. White Southerners, here's how I explain it. White Southerners liked the black man as an individual, but hated the race. The idea being, hey, that Bob is okay to be as my neighbor. Bob works as my neighbor. Bob works in the city as a blacksmith. but there's a general hatred towards African Americans. In the North, the white Northerner would say, oh, I'm fine with African Americans. We should end slavery, but I don't want Bob in my neighborhood. I'd like to maintain segregation. And so you get segregation in unique ways in the North, in that even in the North, blacks are only given the lowest paying jobs, and they can't really advance. And so they're getting racism of different types between the North and the South. And you can see where this free black population was living. You can see that there's New Orleans, but largely nowhere else. And so you get certain cities popping up here and there, large cities along these border states, along the coast, but Maryland, a strong population of Maryland, and then up through on the coast here. And you can see the rise of the black population coming up to the Civil War, in that we get an increased slave population over time, whereas the free black population is pretty steady, but the slave population is vastly increased. The Black Belt, you'll hear this now and then in some of the texts. It's the region where slaves are most concentrated, and you can see this kind of Black Belt form for Virginia all the way down through to the edge of Texas. And this is the Black Belt. It's originally named that because the soil is very rich and dark, but that means that's where the best plantations are going to be. Therefore, you're going to have the highest concentration of black population. And so while it's originally named for black soil, it's also where there's a lot of black people. As far as daily life, you know a lot of this already. Long work days, dawn to dusk in certain seasons. It's not every day that's going to be harsh working conditions as far as the length of time. It'll be the planting season, the harvesting season. There'll be definitely public whipping for any form of disobedience to kind of send a message out to everybody else. You'd have small slave cabins to house entire families. As far as religion, it's a blend of Christian and African elements, especially when it comes to music and the different types of message that you would get in the church, in that black churches would focus more on freedom and redemption. A lot more Old Testament, things like Moses, would be focused more on in these black churches. Another product of this mixing is soul food, which we still enjoy today. And it's got a different history in that it's going to be based on local available ingredients. And so corn is going to be a big ingredient that is an American ingredient. And so we're going to get things like corn muffins and all that. The best cuts of the meat are going to go to the masters. And so the leftovers are what the slaves are going to work with. And they do their best with what they have to work with. And there are ties to African recipes, fried chicken, and greens especially. And that greens you can find in the African diaspora just about everywhere. And a lot of it's just kind of the leftovers. It's the leftover leaves from a lot of the tops of plants. And you can work with that to create certain foods. And so you're going to use the entire animal. And so some of the leftover organ meats, we'll use the intestines to make things like chitlins. And so it's doing what you can with what's left over. As far as slaves in the city, and that there were major southern cities like Charleston. And there was a demand in southern cities for skilled black slaves, in that there's not a lot of plantations in the cities, but there's still a need for labor. And so slaves can be rented out for a season, for a month, for a week. It depends on the contract that they want. Slaves could hire themselves out as artisans on the weekend. So if they have a day off, if they have a night off, they can actually go out and hire themselves off and make their own money. Owners could also hire out their slaves to anybody that they wanted as just a common labor, or if they had a special skill, or to even factory owners in the cities. Treatment of slaves in the cities was less cruel than on the plantations because, well, it's going to make you look like a bad owner if you're whipping your slave out in public. Whereas on the plantations, you're out in the middle of nowhere, so it's much easier to be very harsh. As far as further restrictions on slaves, they were not permitted to read because reading broad ideas, and ideas would bring discontent. There was also the idea that they would be easily could plan rebellions if they could read. And so slavery in the South, you'll hear this a few times, is known as the peculiar institution, that it is a bit weird, but has become a daily part of their lives. Some of the pro-slavery defenses, and you'll see this every now and then as far as how could they justify such a horrible thing, such a peculiar institution? And they did that in a few different ways. And so one was using the Bible in certain ways and reading certain passages of the Bible in certain ways. One of the big ideas is paternalism, that the master is God, and so that you need to obey the master as the same way that you would obey God, obeying the master as your father. Hence paternalism, the idea that the master is a father figure and is taking care of the slaves, and so they should be obedient to them. Another one that's used a lot, and it's a weird story in the Bible, and it's misinterpreted horribly to justify slavery, is Noah's curse on Ham. Ham's son Canaan will be a slave, as well as all of Canaan's descendants. And part of the misinterpretation, it's not even in the Bible, was that dark sin was interpreted as that curse, and therefore anybody with dark skin would be justified to be enslaved according to this misinterpretation of this one biblical story. And you can look up that biblical story on your own. And so the Bible is used a bit in these kind of twisted interpretations. Another thing we get is the myth of the happy slave, and the idea that the slaves are treated well and they're happy and they want to be there. And of course, if they were unhappy, then they'd be beaten. So it's very much a mask that they're wearing. The argument is that northern immigrant workers in Boston in the factories were treated worse than slaves, calling it wage slavery, and that they are not taken care of by their employer. But these slaves are taken care of by their master, provided food, clothing, medical care, and leisure time for their lives. And so again, another twisted argument saying that the slaves are taken care of by this fatherly master. And you can see this most in Song of the South, Zippity-Doo-Dah, where all the slaves are singing happily. And there's definitely problems with that movie, but it's a great example of the myth of the happy slave, that the slaves were happy in the fields. Other ways that they pushed this, they would push propaganda. Here's the result of abolitionism. This crazy idea that all of a sudden you'd have black bosses and white bosses, black workers working alongside white workers. Scary for Southerners at the time, perfectly normal now. And so Southern congressmen adopted a gag rule. This limits or prevents debate in House of Representatives. And so this meant you couldn't even bring up the idea of slavery. You couldn't even talk about it at all. And so no discussion of slavery was allowed in the House of Representatives for quite a long time. And this is definitely a problem. It deprived citizens of the right to be heard. And it just stopped all debate. So we'll stop there.